He was the most feared man in Seoul, a king whose name alone made grown men go silent in dark rooms. Then one night, a car wreck stole everything. No more empire, no more power. Just a broken man in a wheelchair, staring at walls inside his own mansion. His fiancée cried beautifully for the cameras. The city called her a saint. But when the cameras left, she left too. The man who built an underworld with his bare hands was left alone, hungry, in the dark. Until she walked in, like this video. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The accident happened on a Tuesday. That detail never made it into any official report, and Jitae would think about that later. How something that rewrote the entire architecture of his life didn't even warrant a correct timestamp. The police report said Wednesday 0:14 hours. But Jitae knew. He'd been watching the clock on the dashboard of the Mercedes when the truck hit, because he'd been calculating how long it would take to get back to the Gangnam Tower and deal with a supply chain problem that his logistics director had spectacularly failed to handle. 11:58 p.m., Tuesday, the last 2 minutes of an ordinary night. Then the windshield became a white wall of pressure and sound, and the world flipped sideways. He didn't lose consciousness. That was the part nobody understood when they visited him later, speaking in soft voices, in careful syllables like he'd become fragile. He was awake for all of it. The shriek of metal compressing, the way his body snapped against the harness, the sudden and absolute silence after the truck's engine died. He lay there in the collapsed driver's seat for 4 minutes before the first siren reached him, and in those 4 minutes, he did not panic. He assessed. He took inventory of his own body the way he'd been trained to do since he was 19 years old, and learning how organizations survive catastrophe. Left shoulder, dislocated, possibly cracked. Ribs, 3, maybe 4 on the right side. His legs, present, but sending no signal. Nothing. Not pain, not pressure, just absence, which was somehow worse than agony. By the time the paramedics cut him out, Kang Ji-tae had already begun building the next version of himself. He just hadn't decided yet what that version would look like. The decision came 48 hours later in a private room at Samsung Medical Center, where the attending neurosurgeon, a careful man named Dr. Lim, who had the unfortunate habit of clearing his throat before delivering bad news, explained that the spinal compression was severe, the prognosis uncertain, and that full recovery was not something he was prepared to promise. Ji-tae listened to all of it without expression. His father, Kang Byung-ho, sat in the corner chair the entire time, watching his son's face with the patient attention of a man who had spent 67 years reading rooms. After Dr. Lim left, the old man didn't speak for a long time. The monitors beeped. Somewhere down the hall, a woman was crying. "You already know what you want to do," Byung-ho said finally. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about it." "Don't think too long. The longer a man stays in a hospital bed, the more people start adjusting their behavior to account for his absence." Jitae turned his head toward the window. Seoul at night was a grid of cold light, indifferent and enormous. "Serin came this morning." "I know." "She cried." "I know." "She looked good doing it." The old man exhaled slowly through his nose. He was 73 pounds lighter than he'd been a decade ago, and the suit he wore hung off his frame like a flag on a windless day, but his eyes were the same as they'd always been. Dark, measuring, entirely without sentiment. "Jitae, that woman has been practicing that cry in front of a mirror since the day she met you. I've watched her do it. At your cousin's funeral. At the charity gala in Busan. She produces tears the way other people produce small talk. She loves me. She loves what you represent." Byung-ho stood slowly, using the armrest for leverage, and crossed to the bed. He looked down at his son with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite pride. Something in between, something worn smooth by years. "You've tested everyone who ever wanted something from you. Every partner, every lieutenant, every man who sat across a table and told you they were loyal. You've never once taken loyalty on faith. Why would you start now?" Jitae said nothing. "Use this," the old man said quietly. "Not forever. Long enough to know the truth." It took another day. Jitae spent it staring at the ceiling and running calculations. He was not a sentimental man. Sentimentality was a liability he'd surgically removed from himself somewhere around his 22nd birthday, when he'd watched his first mentor betray their organization for a real estate deal and a woman 10 years younger. He'd learned then that the stories people told about themselves were performance, and that the only reliable data was behavior under pressure. Sarin had never been under pressure, not real pressure. She'd been beside him when he was untouchable, when the Black Phoenix Syndicate controlled import routes from Incheon to Busan, and half the city's politicians owed him something they didn't want made public. She'd been on his arm at every function, luminous and practiced and devastating to look at. And she'd told him she loved him with the kind of fluency that should have been a warning sign years ago. He called Han Dae-wook at 7 the following morning. Dae-wook was 41, compact, and constitutionally incapable of surprise, a quality Ji-tae had spent years cultivating in him. He was the Black Phoenix's attorney, consigliere, and the closest thing Ji-tae had to a friend, though neither of them would have used that word. He listened to the full explanation without interrupting, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then was quiet for a moment. "The medical team," he said. "Paid and reassigned, Dr. Lim will be the only one with access to the real records. Everything else gets rewritten. Sarin will need to believe it completely. She will. And the staff, the house staff at Hanam? Reduced to essential personnel. I want minimum witnesses." Another pause. "This is going to be painful, Ji-tae. Not as a strategy, as an experience. I know. You'll be dependent, actually dependent, for appearance's sake. You won't be able to break character when it becomes difficult. I know what I'm doing." "You know what you're planning," Dae-wook said. "Those aren't always the same thing." Ji-tae was discharged 8 days later in a private transport, loaded into a modified van with a hydraulic ramp and a fold-down hospital bed in back. The Hanam compound, a 4-story structure set behind 3-meter walls and mature pine trees that blocked it from the street, had been retrofitted during his hospital stay. A lift installed beside the main staircase, widened doorways on the ground floor, a hospital bed replacing the king-size frame in the master suite, with a motorized controller mounted on the rail. He sat in the wheelchair in the main entrance hall and looked at his house and felt something he hadn't expected, a clean, cold rage at how convincing all of it was. Sarin was there when they brought him in. She was dressed simply, a cream knit top, dark trousers, hair pulled back in a low knot, and the effect was calculated in the way everything about her was calculated, projecting a woman who had set aside her glamour to focus on care. She bent to kiss his forehead as the aide wheeled him past the entrance stairs. "I had them move everything to the ground floor," she said. "Your office can be the study off the garden. I had your desk brought down. Thank you. The physical therapist starts Monday. I spoke to him myself." She walked alongside the wheelchair, one hand resting on the push handle, though the aide was the one doing the pushing. "And I canceled the Singapore trip. Obviously." "You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did." She said it with a kind of practiced lightness, the tone of someone performing graciousness rather than feeling it. "Where else would I be?" Ji-tae said nothing. He watched the house scroll past him from the low angle of the chair, the marble floors, the architectural lighting, the art on the walls that Sarin had selected because it impressed people rather than because anyone in the house actually looked at it. And he noticed that she hadn't once made eye contact with him since he came through the door. She was looking at the aide, at the house, at some middle distance above his head, not at him. He filed that away and said nothing. The first week was a controlled performance on both their parts. Sarin arrived each morning looking composed and left each evening around 9, citing a headache or an early commitment. She organized his medication schedule with the aide and produced a laminated chart for the kitchen that listed approved foods and restricted activities, and she showed the chart to the physical therapist on Monday with the earnest efficiency of a woman managing a project. Ji-tae watched all of it from the wheelchair with the expression of a man learning to accept his circumstances. Inside, he was running surveillance. His phones, 3 of them, 2 known, and one that nobody in the household was aware of, gave him continuous access to Dae-wook and to the encrypted communication channels of the syndicate. The day-to-day operations were being managed by his deputy director, a lean man named Choi Sung-jae, who had enough competence to keep things stable, and not quite enough ambition to be dangerous. Ji-tae reviewed reports each night after the house went quiet, seated at the study desk in the dark with the door locked, the only light coming from the laptop screen. He was still the same man. He just looked different now. By the second week, Sarin had begun arriving later. Not dramatically later, 30 minutes, then an hour, then 90 minutes behind the time she'd established as her routine. Jite didn't comment on it. He ate what the aide brought, attended the physical therapy sessions with the convincing mechanics of a man working hard against a condition that would not improve, and in the evening sat by the garden window and let the hours accumulate. On a Thursday of the second week, the aide left at 6, and Serin had not arrived. At 7, Jite was hungry. This was the part of the plan his father had warned him about, and the part Dae-wook had called painful as an experience. Jite had spent 34 years as a man who moved through rooms and people moved around him, who ate when he chose, who had never in his adult life been in a position of waiting for someone else to decide when he would be fed. And now he sat in the modified study with a tray on the table across the room, 4 feet away, practically close enough to smell, and he could not get to it. Not without breaking the fiction, not without standing up, walking to the tray, and dismantling every hour of construction he'd spent building this test. He sat there. At 8:30, Serin arrived. She came through the front door already talking on her phone, laughing at something the person on the other end had said, and the laugh was the real one. Loose, unguarded, nothing like the measured warmth she deployed when she was aware of an audience. She stopped in the hallway when she registered that the study door was open and Jite was visible from where she stood. The laugh stopped. "I'll call you back," she said into the phone and came to the doorway. "I'm sorry, traffic was terrible." "It's fine." She looked at the untouched tray. "Did you not eat?" "I was waiting." Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly, but the distant cousin of it. The recognition that she'd been caught in a minor failure and was calculating the cost. "I'll have the kitchen send something warm." She was already reaching for her phone again. "There's a restaurant nearby that does a good juk." "Serin." She stopped. "Sit down." She sat, but not comfortably. She chose the armchair furthest from the desk, arranged herself in it with her knees together and her phone face down on the armrest, and produced the expression of attentive concern that she'd been reliably generating since the day of the accident. Jite looked at her for a long moment. In the low evening light, she was genuinely beautiful. Bone structure that photographers spent careers chasing, skin that looked manufactured, the kind of face that made people immediately more generous with their assumptions. He had been generous, too. "Tell me something true," he said. "What does that mean?" "I want you to tell me one thing that's true. Not performed, not managed, just something real." Her eyes moved away from his face for a fraction of a second. A small reflex, quickly corrected, and then she looked at him with an expression he now understood had never been love. It was something more impressive than love. It was a perfect replica, an imitation rendered with such technical skill that the original was no longer the reference point. "I'm tired," she said. "Is that true enough?" "It's a start." She left at 9:15, claiming she'd called the restaurant and the juk would be delivered by 10. It arrived at 10:40. Jite ate it alone at midnight, cold, while reviewing the financial report Dae-wook had sent at 11 with a note attached. She had dinner in Cheongdam with Park Min-sok. Table for 2. 3 hours. Jite finished the juk, closed the laptop, and sat in the dark for a while. Then he started making plans. Imani Brooks had been working for the Black Phoenix Syndicate's above-ground corporate arm, Kang Group Holdings, for 22 months before the accident. Her title was Executive Secretary to the Director of Strategic Affairs, which in practice meant she managed the calendar, correspondence, and operational logistics for a man named Lee Jun, who was the syndicate's public-facing figurehead and whose actual authority extended as far as Jite allowed it to on any given day. She had no knowledge of the criminal infrastructure beneath Kang Group Holdings. This was by design. The separation between the legitimate and illegitimate architecture of the organization was maintained with the precision of surgical compartmentalization, and executive assistants at Lee Jun's level simply did not get access to anything that mattered. What Imani had was competence, consistency, and an almost aggressive lack of interest in office politics. She was 29. She'd come to Seoul 18 months before joining Kang Group, recruited from a finance firm in Chicago by a headhunter who'd been specifically tasked with finding international talent that wouldn't already have loyalties embedded in Seoul's business community. She spoke Korean at a functional level and was improving. She was heavy-set in a way that Korean corporate culture had not entirely adjusted to accepting, and she'd learned very quickly that she would not be navigating the social ecosystems of this office the way some of her colleagues did, on charm and networking lunches, and the careful cultivation of allies in adjacent departments. She was too visible and not the right shape for invisibility, which meant she'd chosen the only remaining option, being undeniably good at what she did. She'd met Jite 4 times in 22 months. Brief, functional interactions. A packet of documents requiring his signature delivered personally because Lee Jun had panicked about courier security. 2 instances of being present in conference room settings where Jitai attended, and once, memorably, an elevator ride where she'd been carrying 3 folders, a laptop bag, and 2 coffees, and he'd held the door without being asked and then not spoken to her for the remaining 12 floors. She had formed no strong impressions of him. He was formidably controlled in a way that projected either extreme discipline or extreme coldness, and she'd never been close enough to determine which. She knew he was engaged to a woman whose name appeared regularly in the society pages of every publication that covered such things. She knew the organization moved around him like water around a fixed stone. She knew, in the imprecise way that people in large organizations always know these things without being told explicitly, that the man at the center of Kang Group Holdings was a different species than the people who worked for him. That was the full extent of her knowledge about Kang Jitai when she showed up at the Hanam compound on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week of his recovery. She was not supposed to be there. The reason she was there was a folder. Lee Jun had a recurring appointment with a document courier who collected his signature-required correspondence every Tuesday and Friday. On the previous Tuesday, the courier had collected a folder from Lee Jun's office that was not intended for collection. It had been placed on the tray by Lee Jun's intern, who had confused 2 similarly colored folders and put the wrong one out. The folder contained draft contracts that required Jitai's personal review and signature, documents that Lee Jun had been advised not to send digitally under any circumstances. When the error was discovered on Thursday morning, Lee Jun had directed Amani to recover the folder from the courier company and deliver it personally to the Hanam compound, because Lee Jun dealt with his own errors by assigning them to someone else and then not thinking about them anymore. Amani retrieved the folder, took the company car, and drove to Hanam. The compound's front gate staff called ahead to the house, and Amani was told to proceed to the side entrance and wait in the vestibule. She sat in the vestibule for 20 minutes, which told her that the household was understaffed or disorganized or both, and then a young aide appeared, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22, visibly harried, with a stain on his collar that he hadn't noticed yet, and told her that the director was in the study, but that he'd stepped away from his desk. "I can wait," Imani said. "It might be a while. I'll wait." The aide led her through the main hallway. The house was very quiet, the kind of quiet that accumulates in spaces where people are present, but not moving, not talking, just existing in separate rooms. Amani was good at reading the temperature of buildings. She'd grown up in a house where silence had different textures, the silence of everyone getting along fine, the silence of something going wrong that nobody was ready to name yet. And the silence in this compound had a specific quality she couldn't immediately identify. The study door was half open. The aide knocked twice and pushed it fully open, and Amani looked in, and the first thing she saw was the wheelchair. The second thing she saw was Jitai. He was not at the desk. He was positioned by the garden window in the chair, and the afternoon light came at him from the left, and he was looking at something outside. The pine trees along the wall, maybe, or just the light itself. And his face in that unguarded moment was not the face of the controlled, impenetrable man she'd seen in conference rooms. It was the face of someone who had been sitting alone in a room for a very long time and had stopped performing even for themselves. He registered their presence and the control came back instantly. Shoulders level, expression cleared, the measured authority reassembled in about 2 seconds flat, but she'd seen the gap. 2 seconds was long enough. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "from Lee Jun's office." "Yes." She held up the folder. "He sent me with the contracts, the ones from Tuesday." "I know what they are." He gestured toward the desk. "Leave them there." She crossed the room and set the folder on the desk, and that was when she noticed the tray on the side table. A covered dish, a cup, a small bowl, all untouched, condensation beginning to form on the inside of the cup cover. She looked at the tray, looked at the position of the wheelchair relative to the table, did the geometry of the room automatically, the way she processed spatial arrangements. And she understood in a moment that the tray was exactly far enough away to be unreachable from the chair without assistance. She looked back at Jite. He was watching her do the calculation. His expression was completely neutral. When did they bring this? She asked. An hour ago. Is someone coming to... The aide stepped out. For an hour. He had other tasks. Amani looked at the tray again, the covered dish, the cup. A man who ran one of the largest corporate entities in South Korea, sitting in a wheelchair in a beautifully appointed room, unable to reach his own lunch. Can I... She started. You can leave the folder and go. That's what you were sent to do. I know what I was sent to do. She was already crossing to the side table. I'm asking if I can bring this to you. A pause. It was very brief. She might have missed it if she hadn't been paying attention. And she was always paying attention. Yes, he said. Thank you. She moved the tray to the rolling cart beside the desk, adjusted the cart to the right height, and lifted the cover on the dish. Rice, braised short rib, some wilted spinach that had seen better times. The cup was tea, now lukewarm. She set everything where he could reach it and stepped back. He ate without speaking. She should have left. She knew she should have left. She had the folder receipt in her bag that needed to be signed and returned to the courier company. She had 3 other tasks queued for the afternoon, and she had no legitimate reason to remain in this room while her employer's employer ate his lunch in silence. She stood by the window and looked at the garden. You didn't have to stay, he said. I know. Lee Jun didn't send you to babysit. No. He sent me to deliver a folder. I did that. She turned from the window. Are you in pain? You don't have to answer that. He considered it. It comes and goes. Is there someone you can call? The aide? The aide will be back. Okay. She picked up her bag from the chair where she'd set it. I'll have the receipt sent digitally. The courier company doesn't need the physical signature back until Monday. Miss Brooks. She stopped at the door. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Not the boardroom authority, not the unguarded exhaustion she'd seen in the first 2 seconds. Something in between. An assessment. Thank you. Sure, she said, and left. She drove back to the Kang Group building and sat in the parking garage for a few minutes before going in. She was thinking about the tray and the geometry of the room and the 2 seconds of unguarded expression and the specific quality of the silence in that compound. She was thinking about what it meant that a man with a full household staff had been sitting alone next to an unreachable lunch for an hour. She was not thinking about Kang Ji-tae the way someone thinks about a mafia boss. She was thinking about him the way she thought about problems, with the particular focused attention she gave to things that didn't add up. She went back inside and returned to her desk, and did not mention the visit to anyone. She didn't think she was going to go back, but 3 days later, on a Sunday when the office was empty, and Amani was working late on a quarterly report that Lee Jun needed Monday morning, she found herself pulling up the Hannum address on her phone. She didn't call ahead. She drove there with a container of jollof rice she'd made the night before, something she'd cooked for herself. Nothing elaborate, nothing she'd prepared with any specific intention, and she sat at the gate for 40 seconds debating the multiple ways this was a terrible idea before pressing the call button. The aide answered. Amani Brooks from Kang Group. I was here Thursday. I have a document update for the director. This was a lie. She was aware of this. The gate opened. The aide met her at the side entrance and led her to the study, and Ji-tae was at the desk this time, the contracts open in front of him, reading with his glasses on. She hadn't known about the glasses. The detail landed with surprising weight, and he looked up when she came in. Ms. Brooks. He took the glasses off slowly. Lee Jun didn't call ahead. He's not aware I'm here. That document update was, I have something for you. She held up the container. She'd put it in one of the reusable ones, not the disposable takeout kind, and it occurred to her standing there that the specificity of the container might communicate something she hadn't decided to communicate yet. I made too much. He looked at the container. He looked at her face. Whatever he found in either one, he said nothing for a moment. Then, sit down, Ms. Brooks. She sat. He opened the container. The smell reached them both. Warm rice, tomatoes, spice, the particular density of something made from scratch over actual time. And something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, but she saw it. He ate. She sat across the desk and opened her laptop and worked on the quarterly report while he ate, and they did not speak. And the silence in the room was a different texture than the silence she'd felt in the compound on Thursday. Quieter, somehow, even with 2 people in it. When he finished, he set the container aside and looked at her. How long have you been in Seoul? 18 months. Before that. Chicago. Family there? My mother, 2 brothers. He nodded slowly. Do you know what this company does, Ms. Brooks? Kang Group Holdings. Corporate strategy and investment. That's what the website says. That's all I know, she said. That's all I need to know. He looked at her for a long moment. You shouldn't come back here. Probably not. Lee Jun will notice eventually. Eventually? Then why are you here? She looked at her laptop screen, then back at him. Because on Thursday, you'd been sitting next to your lunch for an hour and nobody had noticed. And I couldn't stop thinking about that. He didn't respond right away. A car passed outside on the road beyond the compound walls, its headlights briefly visible through the pine trees. You should go, he said finally. It's getting late. She closed the laptop and stood. She looked at the container. I'll get that back another time. Ms. Brooks. She was almost at the door. The jollof rice, he said. It was very good. She left the compound and drove back toward the city, and the lights of Seoul spread out ahead of her. Enormous, indifferent, bright in every direction. And she thought about how she had now been to that house twice without being asked, and without any particular plan, and how both times she had felt, inexplicably, like she was doing something that needed doing. She did not examine this feeling too carefully. That was the beginning of something neither of them had a name for yet. Back in the compound, Ji-tae sat at the desk in the dark after the gate camera confirmed her car had left the property. He pulled out the encrypted phone and typed a message to Dae-wook. Amani Brooks. EA to Lee Jun. Full background check. Clean only. I want the honest picture, not the curated one. Dae-wook's response came in 11 minutes. Already started. Why? Ji-tae looked at the empty container on the edge of the desk. Because she noticed something nobody else did, he typed. And she came back anyway. He put the phone down and turned to the garden window. The pines were dark shapes against the lighter dark of the Seoul sky. And somewhere beyond them, Se-rin was having dinner with a man named Park Min-seok for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. And the city was going about its enormous indifferent business. And Kang Ji-tae, the man the underworld called an untouchable, the man who had staged his own destruction to find the truth, sat alone in a wheelchair in the dark and realized that the most honest thing that had happened to him since the accident was a container of jollof rice from a woman who had no reason to bring it, and no angle to work, and no performance to maintain. That was a problem, not because it was bad, because he did not know yet what to do with something real. Dae-wook's report on Amani Brooks arrived on a Monday, attached to nothing, sent through the encrypted channel as a plain text file with no subject line. Ji-tae read it at 2 in the morning while the compound slept around him. Clean, completely clean. Not in the sanitized way that meant someone had gone through and removed the inconvenient parts, but in the way that meant there was genuinely nothing to remove. Chicago-born, 2nd of 3 children, father absent since she was 11. Mother worked hospital administration for 26 years. Scholarship to Northwestern, finance degree. 4 years at a mid-sized firm in the Loop, consistent performance reviews, no disciplinary incidents, no debt beyond a student loan she was paying down ahead of schedule. Recruited by Kang Group's sole headhunter 14 months before joining, the timeline matched what she'd told him. No criminal record, no litigation history, no pattern of associations that suggested anything other than what she appeared to be. A competent woman working hard in a foreign city, building something steady out of limited materials. At the bottom of the file, Dae-wook had typed a single line. She has no angle, Ji-tae. Some people just don't. Ji-tae read that line 3 times. Then he closed the file and sat in the dark for a while. She came back the following Saturday. No call ahead this time either. She'd apparently decided that announcing herself gave too much opportunity for the answer to be no. The gate staff recognized her now, which was its own kind of problem, and the aide let her in with the mild confusion of someone who'd been told different things by different people and had decided to stop trying to reconcile them. She brought a thermos of something that turned out to be a West African pepper soup, a smell so far outside the olfactory vocabulary of the Hannum compound that it temporarily reorganized the air in the study, and a worn paperback that she set on the corner of his desk without comment, as if she were returning a borrowed item. "What's that?" Ji-tae said. "A book. I can see that. Then why did you ask? She unscrewed the thermos cap and set it in front of him. It's spicy. Tell me if it's too much. He looked at the book. A novel. American. The kind with a cracked spine that suggested it had been read multiple times. The cover image worn soft at the corners. He picked it up. You've read this. Twice. And you brought it here. You've been staring at that garden for 6 weeks. I thought you might want something else to look at. He set the book down and tried the soup. The heat reached him immediately, not aggressive but persistent, building in layers. And he was quiet for a moment. Sit down, he said. She sat. The aide, he said. He's been letting you in without authorization. He's 22 and he's overwhelmed and he's doing his best. That's not a justification. No, she agreed. It's an explanation. They're different things. He looked at her. She was in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a thick knit sweater in a burnt orange color that shouldn't have worked and did. And she'd come straight from somewhere, he could tell, because there was a slight windburn across her cheekbones, and her bag was over one shoulder like she'd grabbed it in motion. She hadn't dressed up for this. She hadn't prepared a version of herself for his benefit. She'd just come. You know this is irregular, he said. I know. Li Jun is going to find out you've been here. Probably. And I'll deal with that when it happens. She looked at him steadily. Are you telling me to stop coming? He should have said yes. The operational logic was clean. An unauthorized civilian with repeated access to the compound was a variable, and Jite did not tolerate uncontrolled variables. He'd built everything he had on the principle that the moment you allowed sentiment to override structure, the structure began to fail. He'd watched other men make that mistake. He'd profited from it. No, he said. She nodded once and opened her own book. She'd brought one for herself too, tucked into the side pocket of her bag, and began to read. They stayed like that for 2 hours. He worked through the soup and half the novel. She read. The compound was quiet around them, and the afternoon light moved across the room in its slow diagonal, and nothing happened that anyone would have described as significant. Jite couldn't remember the last time nothing happening had felt like enough. The problem was serene, not the fact of serene. He'd made a kind of peace with what serene was and what she'd been doing. What Dae-wook's surveillance had revealed wasn't surprising so much as it was clarifying. Park Min-seok was a property developer with syndicate-adjacent financing who'd been circling Seirin's orbit for over a year, and their relationship had moved from social to strategic to explicitly romantic in the 2 months before Jite's accident. The timing was probably not coincidental. Min-seok was ambitious, leveraged to the edge of his actual capacity, and smart enough to understand that proximity to Seirin meant proximity to the Black Phoenix's assets, if she could be persuaded to move those assets in the right direction after the marriage. The problem was that Seirin was escalating. She arrived on a Tuesday evening when Imani happened to be in the compound, an overlap that had not been planned, and that Ji-Tai registered 2 minutes before it occurred when the gate camera showed Seirin's white Porsche turning into the drive. He said nothing to Imani. He watched her close her book and stand, reading the shift in his posture with the accuracy that was becoming a specific and inconvenient feature of her attention. Someone's coming, she said. My fiancé. A beat. Do you want me to... Stay, he said. Sit down. You're here on office business. She sat. Seirin came through the study door 30 seconds later, still in her coat, and stopped when she saw Imani. The stop was very brief, a fraction of a second, the computation running behind her eyes faster than most people could track, and then the warmth came back on like a light switch. Oh, she said pleasantly. I didn't know you had someone with you. Miss Brooks, from Li Jun's office. Jite's voice was neutral, informative. Document review. Of course. Seirin set her bag on the side table and bent to kiss him on the cheek, and Jite observed that the kiss landed about a centimeter from his skin. Close enough to look right, not close enough to be real. I didn't know you were working today, sweetheart. You should have told me. I would have come earlier. It came up suddenly. Seirin straightened and looked at Imani with the particular smile that beautiful women sometimes deployed at other women. Not hostile, exactly, but calibrated to remind everyone in the room of the existing hierarchy. You're from the Chicago office originally? I work here in Seoul, Imani said. Li Jun's team. Right. Serene's eyes moved to the thermos, the two books, the informal arrangement of the room, and processed all of it in about 4 seconds. Well, don't let me interrupt. I just came to check on Jitai. She touched his shoulder lightly. I'll be in the kitchen if you need me. She left. Imani waited until the sound of Seyrin's heels on the marble had fully receded, then said, I should go. She'll want you to go. That's different from whether you should. Imani looked at him for a moment. That's a strange thing to say about your fiancé. Yes, he agreed. She left 15 minutes later anyway, and Jite listened to Seyrin move through the kitchen and then heard her on the phone, voice low, words indistinct, the particular acoustic signature of someone who had moved to the far end of a room to be less audible. He didn't try to hear it. He already knew the shape of what was being said. Dae-wook had texted him 3 days earlier. Min-seok met with a financial attorney last Thursday. Specialty: asset restructuring post-marriage. Serin was at the same building 40 minutes earlier. Different entrance. Jitai had read the message and set the phone down and felt nothing that he hadn't already expected. But the nothing had a different weight now than it had a month ago. Seyrin came back to the study 20 minutes later with a cup of tea she'd made in the kitchen, and she set it in front of him and sat in the chair across the desk with her coat off now, and she looked like everything she'd always looked like, composed and radiant and absolutely in control of every signal she was sending. Who is she? Seyrin asked. I told you, Lee Jun's I know what you told me. Her voice was still pleasant. It was always still pleasant. I'm asking who she is. A secretary. She brings documents. She brought soup. She brought soup. Serin looked at her hands for a moment. Her nails were perfect, always perfect. The specific maintenance of a woman who understood that appearance was infrastructure. Jitai, I've been patient. I think you know that. I've reorganized my entire life around what's happened, and I've done it without... Have you? She stopped. Reorganized your entire life, he said, around what's happened. Yes. Tell me what that looks like. The pleasant expression held, but something underneath it tightened. A minute structural change, like a building settling. I'm here every day. You're here most days for a few hours. He kept his voice level, not accusatory, just precise. Tuesday last week you arrived at 9:15. The 8 had left at 6. The tray had been sitting out since 5. The silence that followed was very specific. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, the silence of someone recalculating. The traffic on that road, she started. Serin. She stopped again. I'm not asking you to explain Tuesday, he said. I'm asking you to tell me what it actually looks like, what you've actually changed. She looked at him for a long moment. The warmth in her face was still technically present. All the correct muscles were doing the correct things, but behind it something had gone still and cold and honest, and it was the most honest he'd ever seen her. I've stayed, she said. That's what I've changed. I stayed when other people wouldn't have. Is that what you've done? Yes. Okay. He picked up the cup of tea. Thank you for the tea. She left an hour later. He heard the Porsche back out of the drive and the gate close behind it, and then the compound was quiet again in the specific way it had been quiet since the beginning of this, the accumulated quiet of a house that was performing a function it had never been designed for. Jitae called Dae-wook. She pushed back tonight, he said when Dae-wook picked up. On what? On the secretary coming here, she noticed the soup. He paused. What's the current status on the Min-seok surveillance? They had lunch in Itaewon today. 2 hours. He paid. A pause on Dae-wook's end. Jitae. She's starting to move faster. The attorney she met with last week, ma'am. I have a source inside that firm. They were discussing prenuptial override scenarios, specifically what happens to jointly held assets if the primary holder becomes permanently incapacitated, and the marriage occurs prior to a formal incapacity ruling. Jitae absorbed this. The streetlight through the pine trees threw a grid of shadows across the study floor that shifted slightly whenever the wind moved. How long before she's ready to move? He asked. My read. She'll push for an accelerated wedding timeline within the next 2 weeks. She needs the marriage to happen before anyone starts questioning your capacity to consent to it. Set the gala. A pause. Jitae. 4 weeks from Saturday, the engagement gala. Make it large. Politicians, press, everyone who's ever wanted to be photographed near the Black Phoenix's money. I want it to be the kind of event that looks like a declaration. And Seyrin? Tell her it was my idea. Tell her I want to celebrate what she's done for me. He let that sit for a moment. She'll love that. Dae-wook exhaled. You're compressing the timeline. She compressed it first. He ended the call and sat for a while in the dark. And he was thinking about the gala, and thinking about what Dae-wook had said, and thinking about asset restructuring attorneys and prenuptial override scenarios. But underneath all of that, running quieter than the rest, harder to look at directly, he was thinking about a burnt orange sweater and a cracked spine novel, and 2 hours of silence that had felt improbably like rest. Imani, for her part, was having a harder week. Lee Jun had found out. Not about the compound visits, not yet, but he'd noticed the Saturday absence and the adjusted hours, and the fact that 2 documents that should have moved on Friday had moved on Monday, and he'd called her into his office on Wednesday morning with the particular expression of a man who had discovered a minor administrative problem and decided to treat it as a character flaw. You've been distracted, he said. I had some personal scheduling conflicts. I need you here, Imani. The Kong Group board review is in 3 weeks. Your organizational work on that is... He waved a hand. I know. I'll have everything ready. And the Hannum visit last week. He looked at her steadily. The director's office flagged an unauthorized document delivery. Her stomach tightened, but nothing reached her face. She'd learned early in Seoul that the only reliable professional protection was an unreadable expression. The contracts were time-sensitive. I delivered them personally. The contracts were flagged the week before. The delivery you made was, what, a follow-up? A document update. Lee Jun looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. He was in his 50s, well-maintained in the way of men who understood that appearance signaled authority, and he'd always treated Imani with the specific professional courtesy of someone who respected her work and was also faintly baffled by her presence. Stay in your lane, Imani. The director's personal matters are above your clearance level. Understood. I mean that. I understand what you mean. She went back to her desk and opened the board review files and worked through the afternoon with the focused intensity she applied to things when she was trying not to think about something else. She was thinking about the compound. She was thinking about the way the study had felt with 2 people in it, both reading, the afternoon moving across the floor. She was thinking about the fiancé's face when she'd walked in, that quarter second of computation, the warmth snapping back on. She was thinking about Jitai saying stay with the same tone he probably used to issue operational directives, and the way she had simply sat back down. She left the office at 8, picked up groceries at the market below her apartment building, and stood in her kitchen at 9 trying to decide whether to make egusi soup or just eat the leftover rice from 2 days ago. She made the egusi soup. She made more than she needed, which was a thing she was doing now apparently, making more than she needed, and she stood at the stove and refused to examine this too carefully because she had a sense that examining it carefully would require her to make a decision about what she was doing, and she wasn't ready to make that decision. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She looked at it. An unknown number. Seoul area code. She didn't answer unknown numbers. It buzzed again. Same number. She picked it up. Yes. Ms. Brooks. The voice was unmistakable, that specific calibration of authority and restraint. I'm sorry to call without notice. I got this number from your personnel file. I should have asked first. She turned the burner down. It's fine. Are you busy? She looked at the pot of soup. No. A pause. I wanted to ask, the book you left. The novel. I finished it tonight. She waited. The ending, he said. What did you think of it? It was such a purely unexpected question, not about documents, not about the compound, not about anything operational, that she was quiet for a second. Then she said, I thought he made the wrong choice. I thought so too. Another pause. I thought he knew it was the wrong choice when he made it. Yeah, she said. I think that's the point. The soup was beginning to smell the way it was supposed to smell, deep and earthy and particular. She stirred it absently. Outside her apartment window, Seoul was doing what Seoul did at 9 on a Wednesday, which was existing at full volume in every direction. Ms. Brooks, Jite said, come Saturday, if you don't have other... I'll come Saturday, she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. The thermos, he said finally. From last week. You left it. I know. I'll get it Saturday. Okay. Okay, she said. She hung up and stood at the stove and stirred the soup and did not examine what she was feeling, because she had a strong suspicion that what she was feeling was the specific variety of complicated that has no clean exit, the kind that arrives quietly and rearranges things before you've had a chance to decide whether to let it in. She ate her soup. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. On Friday evening, Dae-wook sat across from Ji-tae in the study with a tablet between them and his face arranged in the careful neutral he deployed when the news was bad enough to require delivery without inflection. She signed something, he said. Ji-tae looked at the screen. A document image, photographed, not scanned, which meant someone had done it quickly and at an angle. What am I looking at? A preliminary asset inventory, her signature, notarized, dated last Wednesday. She's provided Park Min-seok with a detailed accounting of the Kang Group holdings that she had access to through the engagement. Dae-wook paused. Including 3 subsidiary entities that are not public record. The room was very quiet. She doesn't have that information, Ji-tae said. She shouldn't have access to. She got it from somewhere inside the organization. Someone gave it to her. Dae-wook's voice was steady. He'd learned years ago not to flinch when delivering this kind of news to Ji-tae, because flinching made it worse. I'm working on identifying the source. But Ji-tae, this is no longer just a loyalty test. She's actively building a case for asset transfer. If this document reaches the right attorney before the gala, it won't. You don't know. Find the source. Ji-tae's voice had gone to a place that Dae-wook recognized. Below anger, below anything that could be called emotional. The operational register. The frequency at which decisions got made that people later described as cold-blooded. Find the source, and then come to me before you do anything else. Nothing moves without my direct authorization. Understood. And the gala stays on schedule. Dae-wook closed the tablet and stood. He got to the door and stopped. You're going to burn it down in front of everyone. That's the plan. The source, if it's someone close, then it's someone close, Ji-tae said. Find them. Dae-wook left. Ji-tae sat in the dark study and looked at his hands in the ambient light from the garden, the familiar hands of a man who had built and dismantled and rebuilt things since he was young enough that the work had left marks. And he thought about what it meant that someone inside his organization had given Se-rin non-public subsidiary information, and he thought about the gala 4 weeks out, and he thought about what Dae-wook had said. She's actively building a case. And underneath all of that, quieter and more inconvenient than any of it, he thought about Saturday. He thought about the soup and the book and the phone call and the specific quality of a silence shared with someone who wanted. The source was Choi Sung-jae. Dae-wook delivered this information on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the Friday conversation in the study, and he delivered it in person. Drove to the compound himself rather than sending it through any channel, encrypted or otherwise, because the nature of what he'd found made him unwilling to put it in writing until Ji-tae had heard it first. He sat across the desk and laid a physical folder on the surface between them. Not a tablet, not a phone. Paper, printed the old way, because some information was too heavy to carry on a screen. Ji-tae looked at the folder without touching it. Tell me, Sung-jae has been in contact with Se-rin since August, 4 months before your accident. Dae-wook's voice was flat and even. The voice of a man delivering a report rather than a verdict. Not romantic. Transactional. She approached him at the Busan conference. You remember you sent him in your place because of the Incheon situation, and she spent 2 days building a relationship with him that he apparently decided to interpret as genuine. What did she offer him? Position. She told him that after the marriage, when she had formal access to the organizational structure, she would advocate for him moving into the directorial tier. She told him you'd been planning to restructure his role downward. Ji-tae said nothing. He'd had no such plan. Sung-jae's performance had been adequate, not brilliant, but adequate was sufficient. But the lie was elegant. It used Sung-jae's own insecurity as the mechanism. He gave her the subsidiary files in November, before the accident. Dae-wook paused. He's been feeding her financial documentation on a rolling basis since then. The asset inventory she signed with Min-seok was built from information Sung-jae provided over 3 months. The garden was visible through the study window. The pines moving slightly in the December wind, the stone path wet from overnight rain. Jitai looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the folder. He opened it. The documentation was thorough. Dae-wook had always been thorough. It was the quality Jitai had valued most in him from the beginning. That absolute refusal to leave a loose thread because the presentation looked cleaner without it. Message logs, reconstructed from Sung-jae's personal device through a method Jitai did not ask about. Financial transfer records showing payments to a personal account registered under Sung-jae's mother's name. Meeting logs, a timeline that went back 14 months and moved forward to 48 hours ago. Jitai read every page. When he finished, he closed the folder and set it on the edge of the desk, and was quiet for long enough that the rain outside became audible again. He's been running operations in my name, Jitai said. Yes. While I'm sitting in this room, he's been authorizing movement on the Incheon route using my standing orders as cover, and feeding Seirin the financial architecture so she and Min-suk can... He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers against the desk's surface. How many people in the directorial tier know? I don't believe any of them know the full picture. But Sung-jae has been selectively informing 2 of the regional managers, framing it as contingency planning in case your condition, in case you didn't recover. In case I didn't recover? Yes. So he's been positioning himself as the succession candidate. That's my read. Jitai stood up. He did it without thinking. He'd been so thoroughly inside the fiction of the wheelchair for weeks that the act of simply standing felt like breaking through a membrane. And for a moment he just stood there behind the desk and felt the floor under his feet and breathed. Dae-wook did not react. He'd known the truth from the beginning, and he had the discipline to treat it as unremarkable. Jitai walked to the window. He put his hand against the cold glass and looked at the garden and ran the numbers. 14 months of Sung-jae's access. 3 months of rolling financial disclosures to Seirin. The subsidiary entities she now had documented. 3 of them, all legitimate on paper, all serving specific functions in the organizational structure that would become visible to the wrong people if anyone looked hard enough. Min-seok's attorney working on asset restructuring. The marriage timeline Seirin was about to push for. The gala was in 3 weeks. She's going to accelerate, Jitai said. She already has. Her assistant called the event planning firm yesterday and asked whether the date could be moved forward. She framed it as wanting to give Jitai something to celebrate. He turned from the window. And Sung-jae, where is he right now? In the office, running the Tuesday operations review. Leave him there. Jitai came back to the desk. He sat down, in the chair, not the wheelchair, which was parked beside the desk and would need to be back in position before anyone else came through the door. Don't move on him yet. Don't change his access. Don't signal anything. Dae-wook's expression shifted by a fraction. You want him operational. I want him exactly where he is, doing exactly what he's doing until the gala. After that, he can have whatever he thinks he's going to get. Jitai, if he keeps feeding Seirin, he will keep feeding her. That's fine. Everything she gets from him between now and the gala only makes the evidence package more complete. He looked at Dae-wook steadily. I want her to feel like she's winning. I want her to walk into that ballroom absolutely certain that everything is about to go her way. Dae-wook was quiet for a moment. Then, the trapdoor needs to be deeper than she can see. Yes. I'll need 2 weeks to build the presentation properly. The screens, the documentation display, the audio. You have 3. Don't waste them. Dae-wook picked up the folder and stood. He was at the door when Jitai said his name. He turned. You've known Sung-jae for 6 years, Jitai said. Did you see it? Dae-wook's face was very still. I saw ambition. I didn't see the direction it would go. He paused. That's on me. No, Jitai said. It's on him. Dae-wook left. Jitai sat in the desk chair and put his hands flat on the surface and breathed through his nose and let the information settle into its proper configuration. Not a catastrophe, not yet. A crisis that had structure and therefore had a response. He'd been operating in crisis his entire adult life. He knew its texture. He knew how to move inside it. What he had not expected was how much it would cost him to look at the evidence of Sung-jae's betrayal and feel, underneath the operational cold, something that was not quite grief but adjacent to it. Sung-jae had sat in this room, had attended meetings where loyalty was the only currency that mattered, had eaten at the table of an organization built on the premise that the people inside it were committed to its survival. Jite filed the adjacent to grief feeling in the category of information and moved on. Amani came on Saturday as she'd said she would. She brought a goosey soup in the thermos and a container of fried plantains, and she reclaimed her thermos from the previous week and set the new one in its place with the efficient economy of someone who had stopped treating these visits as events requiring ceremony. She sat across from him and they ate, and the study was warm against the December outside, and Jitai looked at her and thought, she doesn't know any of this. She's sitting 3 feet from the center of it, and she has no idea. You look tired, she said. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you looked tired. She pulled the plantain container toward him. Eat something that isn't whatever you're thinking about. He ate a plantain. Something came up this week. Do you want to talk about it? No. Okay. She opened her book. He watched her for a moment. Imani. She looked up. She'd started using his first name sometime in the last 2 weeks, not formally, not as a decision that was announced, just the way it happened, the gradual erosion of the formality that had always been slightly artificial anyway. She'd been the first one to cross that line. He'd let it happen and then crossed back over it himself, and now they were here, in whatever this was. If something happened to this company, he said, something significant, would you want to know? She looked at him with the focused attention that he'd learned was her default when something mattered. Is something happening? I'm asking hypothetically. No, you're not. He was quiet. Jite. She set this book down. I don't know what this company actually is. I mean, I know what the website says. I know what Lee Jun's operation looks like from the inside. But I'm not naive about the gap between what I can see and what's actually there. She held his gaze. I made a choice to not look into that gap because it wasn't my business and it wasn't going to help me do my job better, but I know the gap is there. And that doesn't bother you. I didn't say that. I said it wasn't my business. She picked up her book again. If something involves me directly, tell me. Otherwise, I'll keep not looking into the gap. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and they returned to the comfortable quiet of the room, and he ate 2 more plantains, and he thought about the gap and what it meant that she'd named it so precisely. The following Friday, he understood why he'd been right to compress the timeline. Daewoo called at 6 in the morning. Jite was already awake. He'd been awake since 4, running numbers on the subsidiary documentation, and he picked up on the first ring. She met with the wedding coordinator last night. Not a planning meeting, a timeline acceleration meeting. She's pushing for the wedding to happen before the gala. Jitai sat up straighter. She wants the ceremony in 10 days. She's framing it as a private event. Just family and close friends. Daewoo's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Jitai, a private ceremony means no press, no witnesses outside her chosen circle, no one to see what she's wearing or hear what she says, and no one to see who's there and who isn't. She's removing your people from the room. A private ceremony with her guest list means she controls who witnesses the marriage. And if you're legally married before the gala, the asset restructuring timelines Min Seok's attorney has been building become legally actionable within 48 hours of the ceremony, Jite said. If she moves fast enough, she can file before you have a chance to stand up, Daewoo said. Yes. Jite was quiet for 4 seconds. He counted them. Move the gala, he said. To when? 1 week from tonight. A pause. Jite, the documentation package isn't, I told you 2 weeks. Use what we have. What we have is enough. If it's not complete, Han Dae-wook. Jitai's voice dropped to the register that Dae-wook had heard maybe a dozen times in 12 years. Not louder, not harder, just bottomless in a way that removed all other options. If she marries me first, we lose everything. The subsidiary files she has are enough to restructure 2 of the 3 entities before any legal challenge can be filed. Min Seok has the attorney and the capital ready to move. She is not waiting, so we don't wait. Dae-wook exhaled. 1 week. Make it beautiful. Make it the kind of night that feels like a celebration. And Serin, call her this afternoon. Tell her I want to move the gala up because I'm feeling stronger. Tell her I want to give her a night she'll remember. She'll think she's running out of time. She is running out of time, but I want her to think she has just enough. He ended the call and sat in the early morning dark of the study and worked through the geometry of the next 7 days. What needed to move? What needed to stay still? Where the variables were, and which ones he could control, and which ones he couldn't. Sungjae was still in position. Serin was about to receive a call that would simultaneously reassure her and accelerate her private panic. Minsok's attorney was building a case on 3 months of financial documentation that was about to become exhibit evidence. And somewhere across the city, Imani was probably making coffee in her apartment and preparing for a Saturday that would now be different from what she expected. He called her number. She picked up on the third ring. He could hear the ambient sound of her kitchen. The particular acoustic of a small Seoul apartment in the morning, traffic and pipes, and the specific frequency of a city that never quite went fully quiet. "It's early," she said. Not accusatory, just noting. "I know. I'm sorry. Is something wrong?" He looked at the garden through the window. The pines were dark in the pre-dawn, barely distinguishable from the sky behind them. "Don't come Saturday," he said. A pause. "Okay. Not because—" He stopped. Started again. "There's something happening next Friday. An event. I need the week to prepare for it, and the compound is going to have more traffic than usual, and I need you not to be in the middle of this." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" "Yes." "Are you in danger?" The question landed with unexpected directness. He hadn't expected her to ask it that plainly. "No," he said. "Okay." Another pause. "Jitae, whatever this is, you know you can—" She stopped herself. "What?" "Nothing. I was going to say something that's probably not my place." "Say it." She was quiet for a beat. "You don't have to manage everything alone. That's all." He didn't respond right away. The pre-dawn light was beginning to gray the edges of the garden, the pines slowly separating from the sky, and the compound was very still, and he sat with what she'd said and felt it settle in some place that he hadn't known was waiting for something to settle there. "I'll call you after Friday," he said. "I'll be here." He hung up and sat with the phone in his hand and thought about 7 days in a ballroom full of people who believed the story they'd been told about Kang Ji-tae and his devoted fiancée, and he thought about what it would look like when that story ended. Then Serene arrived. He hadn't expected her until afternoon. She'd been coming later and later, the erosion of the pretense now measurable in hour increments. But it was 9:15 in the morning when the gate camera showed her white Porsche in the drive, and he had approximately 90 seconds to move from the desk chair to the wheelchair and settle into it with the practiced positioning of a man who had been living in it for weeks. He made it with 4 seconds to spare. She came through the front door fast, coat still on, and the energy she was carrying was different from anything he'd seen from her before. Not the managed warmth, not the calibrated performance. She was moving with the suppressed urgency of someone who had received news and was trying to decide how to use it. "Dae-wook called me," she said from the doorway. "Good morning." "He said you want to move the gala to next Friday." "I'm feeling stronger." I thought, "Next Friday." She came into the room and stopped in the center of it, her coat still buttoned, her bag still on her shoulder. She hadn't sat down. She was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her before, the composure fractured, not gone but visibly under pressure, like glass in cold weather. "That's 1 week, Ji-tae." "I know. Is that a problem?" It's—" She caught herself. Reset. The composure reassembled with visible effort. "I just want to make sure we do it right. A gala like this, the planning alone. Dae-wook's handling it. He says he can have everything ready. The guest list alone is already built. I've been thinking about this for weeks." He kept his voice light, warm, even. The voice of a man who had been lonely and diminished and had decided to celebrate his survival. "Serin, I want to give you something. You've been here through all of this, and I want everyone to see that. I want to stand in front of—" He paused, adjusted. "I want to be there, in front of everyone who matters, and let them see what you've done." She looked at him, and for just a moment, a fraction of a moment, the gap between one breath and the next, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't calculation and wasn't warmth and wasn't performance. It was something older and smaller and more human than any of those things. It was the face of a woman who understood, in her animal nervous system, if not in her conscious mind, that something had shifted and that the shift was not in her favor, and that she could not yet identify the mechanism. Then it was gone. "Of course," she said. The warmth came back. "Next Friday? Whatever you want." She stayed for 40 minutes. She made calls from the kitchen, her voice too low to hear, and she drank the tea she made for herself and not for him. And she left at 10 with a kiss that landed a centimeter from his face and the promise that she'd call the florist about the centerpieces. Jite sat in the wheelchair after she left and listened to the gate close and felt something he identified with clinical precision as the closing of a door. Not the gate. Something else. He pulled out the encrypted phone and sent a message to Dae-wook. "She's running. She won't show it, but she's running. Make sure the documentation is airtight on the subsidiary transfers, all 3 entities. I want it bulletproof." Then he sat back and looked at his hands, the familiar hands, the hands that had built things and taken things apart. And he thought about next Friday, and he thought about the ballroom full of people, and he thought about the moment when he would stand up from the wheelchair in front of all of them, and the story Serin had been telling about herself would end, and a different story would begin. He was ready for that. What he was less ready for, what he sat with in the compound's quiet morning and did not quite know how to hold, was the understanding that after Friday, when the test was finished and the performance was over and the truth was public and irreversible, he would have to figure out what came next. Not for the organization, for himself. That was the part nobody had written a plan for. That night, long after the compound had gone dark and silent, Dae-wook sent one final message. Found the third payment from Sung-jae to Se-ran, dated last Tuesday. He knows the gala is coming. He's trying to get her everything she needs before it happens. Ji-tae. He's not going to stop on his own. Ji-tae read the message in the dark study, the only light the phone screen, and typed back, "He doesn't need to stop. He just needs to keep going for 6 more days." He set the phone down. He looked at the garden. And for the first time since the beginning of this, since the car wreck on a Tuesday night and his father's measured voice in the hospital room and the decision to build a test from the rubble of his own destruction, Kang Ji-tae felt the full weight of what it had cost him to find out the truth. Not just Se-rin, not just Sung-jae, the weight of having lived for 2 months in a version of himself that was diminished and dependent and exposed, and having discovered in that diminishment that the most real thing that had happened to him was a woman who came without being asked and sat across from him and said, "You don't have to manage everything alone," and meant it with every unrehearsed, unperformed, unstrategic syllable. 6 days. He would hold all of it together for 6 more days, and then the masks would... The 6 days moved like 6 different kinds of weather. Monday was cold and administrative. Ji-tae spent 11 hours at the desk reviewing the documentation package Dae-wook was building, going through every page with the focused attention of a man who understood that a single evidentiary gap could become the thing a good attorney used to unravel everything else. The subsidiary transfer records, the notarized asset inventory Se-rin had signed, the message logs between Sung-jae and Se-rin reconstructed across 14 months, the surveillance photographs of Se-rin and Min Seok, restaurants, a hotel lobby in Itaewon, the parking structure of the building where Min Seok's attorney kept his office. The recorded phone calls, 3 of them, captured through methods that would never be admissible in any court, but would play with devastating clarity on a ballroom screen in front of 400 witnesses who didn't need legal standards of proof. Tuesday was the day Sung-jae made his last transfer. Dae-wook confirmed it at noon. A final packet of documentation, sent from a personal device, to an encrypted address that had been patiently unraveled over the previous 10 days. Financial projections for 2 of the 3 subsidiary entities, annotated in Sung-jae's hand with notes about asset liquidity timelines. The kind of document that took months to compile and represented, in its specificity, the full measure of what Sung-jae had been building toward. Ji-tae read the confirmation and felt nothing that surprised him. What surprised him was the steadiness of his own hands. Wednesday. Se-rin called twice. The first call was about the gala's floral arrangements. She'd taken over the centerpiece decisions from the event coordinator and wanted Ji-tae's input on white orchids versus white peonies, which was the kind of question that had no wrong answer and served no purpose except to make the caller feel in control of something. Ji-tae said orchids. She said wonderful. The second call came at 9 in the evening and was shorter. She'd heard from the wedding coordinator, she said, and perhaps they should talk about the private ceremony idea she'd been considering. Something intimate, just the people who mattered. And Jitai said that sounded lovely and suggested they discuss it at the gala, in person, when they could make a real decision together. She agreed with the warmth of a woman who was rapidly losing confidence in her own timeline and compensating by agreeing to everything. He hung up and sat in the quiet of the study and thought about orchids. Thursday was the day the compound filled with people. Daewook arrived in the morning with 2 members of the technical team who spent 6 hours running cables and testing the ballroom screen system. The Hanam compound had a formal ballroom on the ground floor, a room Jitai used perhaps 3 times a year for organizational events, high-ceilinged and cold when empty, capable of seating 300 with room for another 100 standing at the perimeter. The screens were large-format displays mounted on the side walls, used ordinarily for presentation decks and organizational communications. Tonight, in less than 48 hours, they would show something else. Jitai watched the technical team work from the doorway of the ballroom. He was in the wheelchair. He'd been back in the wheelchair since Monday, maintaining the fiction for the household staff and for Saren's visits. Maintaining it with the same discipline he'd applied from the beginning, though the discipline was costing more now than it had in the early weeks. Not physically, psychologically. The closer the gala came, the more the fiction chafed, the way a too-tight collar chafes, not painful, but present, a constant low-level reminder of constraint. "The audio sync," he said to the lead technician. "Ready for final test tomorrow morning, sir. I want it tested twice, the recordings especially." "Understood." He turned the wheelchair and went back to the study. Daewook followed him. "The guest confirmations," Daewook said, closing the study door. "We have 412 confirmed. The senator is coming. Deputy Commissioner Wu confirmed this morning." He set a list on the desk. "Min-seok confirmed last night." Jitai looked up. "She invited him?" Seren gave the coordinator a supplemental guest list on Tuesday. Min-seok was on it. "She listed him as a business associate of yours." The audacity of it landed with a specific weight, not outrage, something more precise than that, an almost technical appreciation for the scale of the miscalculation. She was bringing him into the room. She was going to stand at the podium and deliver her performance of devotion while the man she'd been building a future with sat in the audience watching, and she believed, with the full confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong before, that she was in control of the evening. "Let him come," Jitai said. "Jitai, let him sit in the front section. Make sure he has a good view of the screens." Daewook looked at him for a moment. "The senator is going to have questions after." "The senator always has questions. That's what makes him useful." Jitai turned to the window. "Make sure Deputy Commissioner Wu is positioned near the east entrance after the reveal. I want official presence visible when Sung-jae tries to leave." "You want him arrested there, in the ballroom?" "I want him to understand in a room full of witnesses what his choices cost him." Jitai's voice was even. "The formal process can happen wherever the deputy commissioner decides to take him. I just want Sung-jae to be in that room when the screens come on." Daewook nodded slowly. "He'll be there. He thinks he's attending as acting director." "He is attending as acting director, right up until he isn't." Friday arrived the way significant days always arrived for Jitai, without ceremony, the morning unremarkable. The light through the study window, the same gray December light it had been all week. He woke at 5, showered, stood in the bathroom looking at his own face in the mirror for a while. He hadn't done that in weeks. Stood, and actually looked. The man looking back at him was not the man who had been loaded into the ambulance 7 weeks ago, and was not the man who had sat in conference rooms projecting untouchability, and was not the broken figure in the wheelchair that the household staff saw every day. He was something between all of those, something that had been assembled from the pieces of the test, and he stood there and looked at it and decided it was enough. He dressed carefully. Dark suit, no tie. He had a tie in the desk drawer for later. At 9, Imani called. He'd been expecting it. He told her he would call after Friday, which implied the evening, but she was calling at 9 in the morning, which told him she'd been awake for a while and hadn't been able to not call. "Tonight's the gala," she said when he picked up. "Yes." "Are you ready?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Is there anything—" She stopped. He could hear her breathing, the particular rhythm of someone choosing words carefully. "I know you said you'd call after. I wanted you to know that I'll be awake, whatever time it is." Something moved in his chest. He identified it without examining it. "Imani." "Yeah." After tonight, things are going to be different. There are things I need to explain to you, things about this company, and about what I am that you've been choosing not to look at, she said. I know. After tonight, you'll have to decide what you want to do with that. I know that too. A pause. Ji-Tai. I've been making choices about you for 7 weeks that I couldn't entirely explain to myself. I don't think one more night changes that. He held the phone and looked at the gray morning through the window. I'll call you after, he said. I'll be awake. He hung up and sat for a while and then went back to work. By 4 in the afternoon, the ballroom was ready. Ji-Tai went through it once, alone, rolling through the space in the wheelchair with the door closed and the lights at half. The round tables were set, white linen. The orchid Seirin had chosen at the centers in low arrangements that wouldn't obstruct sight lines. The screens on both walls were dark but live, connected to Dae-wook's system in the adjacent room. The podium was positioned at the front of the room, angled so that a speaker facing the audience would be facing the main entrance, and the main entrance was directly opposite the larger of the two screens. Ji-Tai sat in the center of the room and looked at the layout and ran it forward in his mind. The arrival, the dinner, the speeches, the specific moment he'd identified as the pivot point. And he was still running it when Dae-wook came in. She's here, Dae-wook said. Early. She's upstairs getting ready. How does she seem? Focused? Her stylist has been up there for 2 hours. He paused. She's wearing white. Ji-Tai looked at the orchids on the nearest table. Of course she is. The guests began arriving at 7. Ji-Tai positioned himself near the ballroom entrance in the wheelchair, flanked by 2 staff members, and he greeted each arrival with the composed warmth of a man who had survived catastrophe and emerged grateful. The senator. The deputy commissioner, who shook Ji-Tai's hand and held it a half-second longer than necessary, which was a language Ji-Tai understood. Acknowledgement. The professional recognition between men who operated in different sectors of the same city's power structure. Business leaders. Social figures. The journalist Seirin had invited because she understood the value of a documented evening. Sung-jae arrived at 7:20 in a dark suit, his expression carrying the particular quality of suppressed anticipation that Ji-Tai recognized immediately. The face of a man who believed he was watching the end of an era and was already positioning himself for what came after. He shook Ji-Tai's hand with the careful solicitousness of someone performing loyalty for an audience. And Ji-Tai held his grip for a moment and looked at him and said nothing except welcome. And Sung-jae went inside and found his seat. Min-seok arrived at 7:35. He was taller than Ji-Tai had expected from the surveillance photographs, broad-shouldered, conventionally handsome, in the way of men who spent money on appearing effortless, wearing a suit that cost what a mid-level employee made in 2 months. He shook Ji-Tai's hand with the smooth confidence of a man who had decided in advance that he would not be rattled by this. And Ji-Tai looked at him, really looked, the full assessment, unhurried, and saw, beneath the confidence, something small and rapid moving behind his eyes. Fear. The faint animal trace of it. Mr. Park, Ji-Tai said pleasantly, I'm glad you could come. I wouldn't have missed it, Min-seok said, and his voice only fractured on the last syllable, barely enough to catch. Seirin came down at 8. The room saw her before Ji-Tai did. He heard the quality of the sound change, the particular collective intake of breath that beautiful women in beautiful rooms produced, and he turned the wheelchair and watched her come through the ballroom entrance. She was, in the most technical and objective sense, stunning. The white dress was architectural, structured at the shoulders, fluid below, the kind of garment that required a specific body and a specific bearing to carry, and she carried it the way she carried everything, as though it had been designed for her specifically, and the rest of the world was simply the backdrop. Her hair was up, her jewelry was minimal. She had calculated with absolute precision the image she was presenting. Devoted, radiant, a woman who had set aside her own comfort for love and who wore sacrifice beautifully. She crossed the room to Ji-Tai and bent to kiss his cheek, and this time in front of 400 people, the kiss actually landed. He felt the warmth of it and the calculation behind it simultaneously. You look wonderful, she said softly for the room. So do you, he said. Dinner was served at 8:30. Ji-Tai ate almost nothing. He sat at the head table and moved the food around his plate and watched the room and listened to conversations and tracked the positions of the people who mattered. Sung-jae, at a table to the left, working through his second glass of wine. the suppressed anticipation now shading into something looser. Min Seok 4 tables back, eating carefully and not drinking, the discipline of a man who understood that tonight required full faculties. Dai Wook at the perimeter, never sitting, moving with the quiet, systematic attention of someone running a sequence. Deputy Commissioner Wu near the east entrance, exactly where Ji-tae had asked. Serin was at his right hand, talking to the senator's wife with animated warmth, laughing at the right moments, touching Ji-tae's arm at intervals that were timed to be visible without being theatrical. At 9:40, the dinner service cleared. At 9:50, the event coordinator tapped the microphone at the podium. Ji-tae felt his heart rate climb, the first time in the entire evening that his body had broken from the flat line of operational calm. Not fear, something older and more physical. The pre-action state, the full-body recognition that the sequence was beginning and could not be reversed. He breathed through it. Serin stood. She moved to the podium with the grace of someone who had been preparing for this moment, not for weeks but for years, who had been building, in every room she'd ever entered, toward a night exactly like this, when 400 people who controlled the architecture of an entire city would watch her and see what she had decided they would see. She adjusted the microphone with one hand. She looked out at the room and let the silence build for exactly the right number of seconds. And then she spoke. Her voice was perfect. He'd known it would be. He'd heard her practice the specific calibration of emotion and restraint that she could deploy in public spaces, the way an opera singer knows their instrument. But hearing it in the ballroom, amplified, reaching every corner of the room, he felt the quality of it land in his chest like something physical. She talked about the accident. She talked about the night she'd received the call, the hospital, the first time she'd seen him in the wheelchair. She talked about fear and love and the decision to stay. She talked about what it meant to love someone not for what they could give you, but for who they were. She talked about sacrifice with the fluency of someone for whom sacrifice was an entirely theoretical concept. And she did it with such technical perfection that 2 women at a nearby table were visibly crying. The room was absolutely with her. Ji-tae sat in the wheelchair and listened and watched her face, and he thought, she is extraordinary at this. The waste of it. The specific, almost painful waste of what she could have been if what she was had been pointed in a different direction, hit him for just a moment, and then he let it go. She was reaching the end. He knew the shape of it, the closing crescendo, the final declaration, the turn toward him that would bring the room's gaze to his face and create the image she intended as the defining photograph of the evening. The powerful man in the wheelchair, diminished, and the devoted woman beside him, luminous, a composition that said everything about loyalty and love and the stories people tell about themselves in front of witnesses. This man, she said, her voice dropping to the register that carried intimacy into a room of 400, has given me everything, and I want the world to know. Ji-tae stood up. He did it without announcement, without drama. He simply placed his hands on the wheelchair's arms and pushed himself upright, and the movement was so quiet and so complete that the first people to see it didn't process it immediately. There was a delay, the brain's brief refusal of information that contradicts established reality, and then the delay ended. The room detonated into silence, not quiet. Silence, the active, pressurized kind, the kind that has mass. Serin turned. Her face in the moment she saw him standing was the only genuinely unperformed thing he had ever seen from her. The control vanished completely. Not for long, 2 seconds, perhaps 3. And what was underneath it was not love and was not guilt and was not the theatrical devastation of a woman whose scheme had been uncovered. It was something rawer than all of those things. It was the face of someone who has built a structure they believed was permanent and is watching it become air. Then the control came back. Not all the way. Enough to hold her upright. Ji-tae buttoned his jacket. He walked to the podium. Not quickly, not slowly, the measured pace of a man who was not performing anything because he no longer needed to. And Serin stepped aside because there was nothing else she could do, and the room was so silent that his footsteps on the wood floor were audible at the back wall. He stood at the podium and looked out at 400 faces. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, he said. His voice was level. No amplified emotion, no orchestrated warmth, just the voice of a man in his own house speaking plainly. I also want to apologize for the deception. Not the deception you're about to witness. For this one, I don't apologize. For the one that brought you here tonight under a false premise. He looked at Serin, She was standing 6 feet away, perfectly still, the white dress incandescent under the ballroom lighting, her face a study in controlled collapse. 7 weeks ago I staged an accident, Jite said. The paralysis was not real. The wheelchair was a tool. What it was designed to do was remove every reason anyone had to perform loyalty for me and see what remained. He paused. I learned a great deal. He nodded to Dae-wook. The screens came on. The first image was a photograph. Se-rin and Min Seok at a restaurant in Cheongdam, leaning across a table toward each other, his hand over hers, the body language of people who are not business associates. The timestamp in the corner read 3 weeks after Jitae's accident. The room inhaled. The second image, the notarized asset inventory. Se-rin's signature, large and identifiable, at the bottom of a document that listed 3 non-public Kang Group subsidiary entities by name and provided their financial structures in detail she had no legitimate access to. Someone in the back of the room said something that wasn't quite a word. The third, a message log. Se-rin's number at the top. 14 months of correspondence with a contact saved as a single initial, S, that a text overlay identified as Choi Sung-jae, Deputy Director of Operations, Kang Group Holdings. The messages were visible in fragments, enough fragments to assemble the shape of what they were. Jitae heard, in the middle of the room, a chair scrape back. He looked. Sung-jae was on his feet. Sit down, Jitae said. Not loud, not into the microphone, just across the room, direct. Sung-jae sat. The fourth image, audio waveform. Dae-wook's voice came through the speakers, brief, clinical. The following recording was made on November 14th, and then Se-rin's voice filled the ballroom, and she was laughing, and she was saying, in the loose, unguarded register of someone who believed they were entirely private. He can't even reach his own food, Min Seok. He just sits there. It would be almost sad if there weren't so much money attached to it. The room broke. Not loudly. The breaking was almost quiet. The collective sound of 400 people simultaneously revising their understanding of everything they'd seen and heard in the last 90 minutes. The social and psychological equivalent of a building settling after an earthquake. Every connection shifting fractionally into a new configuration. Se-rin's face had gone completely still. Min Seok was looking at the screen with the expression of a man watching the specific mechanism of his own destruction operate and being unable to stop it. Jitae stepped away from the podium. He crossed the 6 feet between himself and Se-rin, and he stood in front of her, and he looked at her face, really looked, the way he had not allowed himself to look for the entire performance of the last 7 weeks, the way you look at something when you are finally done being afraid of what you'll see. And what he saw was a woman who was not devastated and was not remorseful and was not in love, and never had been, and he found that the knowledge of this, now that it was fully public and irreversible, did not hurt the way he had expected. It just felt like the end of something that had been over for a long time. You're finished, he said quietly, just to her. The microphone was behind them. Every connection you have to this organization ends tonight. Every financial instrument, every social arrangement, every door that opened because of my name. All of it. She looked at him. Her chin was up. Even now, even stripped, exposed in front of the entire room, she held her chin up, and he gave her that, the last thing he would ever give her. You planned this from the beginning, she said. Her voice was almost steady. The accident. All of it. Yes. You used me. You used me first, he said. I just did it better. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned. And the turn was the last perfect thing she did, executed with the full technical command of a woman who had spent a lifetime controlling how she was seen. And she walked through the ballroom toward the main entrance, and the crowd parted for her, and she was gone. The room was absolutely still. Jitae turned back to the 400 faces. He found the deputy commissioner near the east entrance, who gave a small, precise nod. He found Sung-jae, still seated, his face the color of old concrete. He found Min Seok, who was looking at the door Se-rin had just walked through with the expression of a man who had just understood that he was alone in a room full of people who... The room came back to life in pieces. It didn't happen all at once. 400 people didn't collectively exhale and return to themselves on a single beat. It happened the way feeling returns to a numbed limb. In patches, unevenly, with a faint discomfort that was the sensation of circulation resuming after a long absence. A voice here. The scrape of a chair there. Someone near the back began speaking in a low, urgent tone to the person beside them, and that broke something. And then the sound built in gradual increments until the ballroom was producing the particular noise of a crowd that has witnessed something it will be discussing for years and has not yet agreed on what to call it. Jite stood at the front of the room and let it happen. He was aware of Dae-wook moving through the periphery, the efficient, unobtrusive movement of a man executing a sequence that had been planned to the minute. He was aware of Deputy Commissioner Wu near the east entrance, in conversation now with two men in plain clothes who had been present in the room all evening and had been, to every observer, simply guests. He was aware of Sung-jae, still seated at his table, not moving, his hands flat on the white linen in front of him with the stillness of a man who had assessed his options and found them reduced to one. Wait. Min-seok had stood. Ji-tae tracked him in his peripheral vision, the broad-shouldered figure moving toward the main entrance with the controlled urgency of someone trying not to appear to be leaving, which was the most transparent thing a person could do in a room full of people trained to read exits. Ji-tae caught Dae-wook's eye. Dae-wook tilted his head toward the entrance by a fraction of a degree. The two men near the deputy commissioner shifted position. Min-seok made it as far as the vestibule. Ji-tae didn't follow. He didn't need to. He turned back to the room and found the senator, who was standing beside his table with the expression of a man carefully composing his public face, sympathy and gravity, and the practiced neutrality of someone who needed to be on the right side of this evening's history before he committed to a response. "A word," Ji-tae said. The senator came. They stood near the side wall, out of the main current of the room's movement, and the senator said, "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most dangerous." "Both," Ji-tae said. "I need the asset protection filing to move through your committee by end of next week. The 3 subsidiary entities on the screen. The documentation package goes to your office in the morning." The senator looked at him for a moment. "You planned the legal piece before tonight. I plan everything before the night it happens." "The woman, Serene, she'll have attorneys by morning." "She will. They'll find that every instrument she signed with Min-seok's firm is voided by a pre-existing organizational structure that predates the engagement by 6 years. Ji-tae held the senator's gaze. She signed documents with information she wasn't supposed to have. That's not an asset claim, that's evidence. The senator absorbed this. He was a careful man, had survived 4 administrations by being careful. And his carefulness was visible now in the way he processed what he was hearing, running it against his own risk architecture. Then he nodded, once. "Monday morning." "Thank you." He left the senator and turned back to the room and found, crossing toward him with the direct unhurried movement of a man who had made a decision and was honoring it, Han Dae-wook. "Sung-jae," Dae-wook said quietly when he reached him. "Yes." "He'd like to speak with you." "I know." "Ji-tae," Dae-wook paused. "He's not going to give you what you're hoping for." "I know that too." He crossed the room to Sung-jae's table. The guests nearby had redistributed themselves. The social instinct for distance from a man whose catastrophe had just been made public operated automatically, and Sung-jae sat alone at a table that had been full 20 minutes ago, his wine glass still in front of him, untouched since the screens had come on. Ji-tae pulled out a chair and sat. Sung-jae looked at him. His face was not what Ji-tae had expected. Not defiant, not broken, not the theatrical devastation of a man caught in a public unraveling. He looked tired. Profoundly, organically tired. The fatigue of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been relieved of it, and is discovering that the absence of the weight is its own kind of pain. "How long did you know?" Sung-jae asked. 11 days. "And before that?" "I suspected earlier. I didn't have the documentation until 11 days ago." Ji-tae rested his hands on the table. "Why, Sung-jae? Just tell me why." Sung-jae looked at the wine glass. He turned it slowly by the stem, a small rotation, back and forth. "She told me you were planning to restructure my position, move me laterally into an advisory function. I wasn't. I know that now. Did you check? Did you ask anyone, verify anything, look at a single piece of evidence before you decided to believe her?" Sung-jae's jaw tightened. She was convincing. She's always convincing. That was the point. Ji-tae was quiet for a moment. "You've been with this organization for 6 years. You sat in my office. You attended the meetings where we discussed exactly this kind of approach, exactly this kind of leveraged access, people getting close to us through personal relationships and using the proximity to extract information. You knew the mechanics. I know. And you still. I know. Sungjae's voice was flat, not defensive, past defense. She made me feel like... He stopped, started again. She paid attention to me. That's all. She sat across a table in Busan and paid attention to what I said and asked questions and made me feel like what I thought mattered. He finally looked up from the wine glass. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. Jitae looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what it meant that a man who had watched the mechanics of manipulation operate at close range for 6 years had still been undone by the basic ancient tool of being made to feel seen. He thought about the compound and the wheelchair and the tray 4 feet away, and the specific quality of attention that Amani Brooks brought to a room she had no reason to enter. He thought about how it wasn't the complexity that got you. It was always the simple thing. The deputy commissioner is going to come to this table in a few minutes, Jitae said. There's a formal process from here. I didn't design it to be cruel. It will be what it is. Sungjae nodded. The families, Jitae said. Your mother, your sister. They're not touched by this. I want you to hear that directly from me. Whatever happens to you through the process, it stops at you. Something moved through Sungjae's face. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than gratitude. The collision of relief and shame, which produces an expression that has no clean name. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. Jitae stood. It was never about your family. He walked away from the table and did not look back when he heard, 10 seconds later, the deputy commissioner's measured footsteps crossing the wood floor toward where Sungjae sat alone with his untouched wine. The ballroom was emptying by 11. The guests moved out in streams, the social figures first, eager to be elsewhere before the evening's associations calcified into something they'd need to manage publicly. The business figures more slowly, in clusters of 2 and 3, speaking in the low urgent tones of people who were already calculating the structural implications of what they'd witnessed. The senator left with his wife and gave Jitae a look on the way out that contained, compressed into a single glance, an entire conversation about the week ahead. Dae-wook appeared at Jitae's shoulder at 11:20. Min Seok? What happened? He's in a car with 2 of Woo's people. The attorney on the asset restructuring has been contacted. The filing they were building is being characterized formally as conspiracy to commit financial fraud via procurement of confidential organizational documents. Dae-wook paused. He had a phone on him. 6 unanswered calls from Sirin since 10:50. Jitae thought about that. Sirin, somewhere in the city, calling a number that wasn't being answered, sitting with the full weight of an evening that had gone in a direction she had not prepared for. He tried to locate something in himself. Not sympathy, he wasn't looking for sympathy. Some understanding of what that felt like. The complete structural failure of something you'd built over years and believed in with total confidence. He found a distant and impersonal kind of sorrow. Not for her specifically. For the general human capacity to be so wrong about the things you've decided are certain. Let her call, he said. She'll have attorneys by morning, Dae-wook said. Like the senator said. I know. We're ready for that. He looked at the almost empty ballroom, the staff beginning to move between the tables, the orchid centerpieces still intact, the screens dark now, the chairs in the disorder that follows an evening that ended differently from how it was planned. Go home, Dae-wook. Jitae, there's nothing else tonight. Go home. Dae-wook looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a man who wanted to say something and had decided it would keep. The car's out front when you're ready. He left. Jitae stood alone in the ballroom. He stood there for a while. The staff moved around him with the practiced invisibility of people who understood that the man in the center of the room needed to be left alone with whatever he was standing in. He looked at the dark screens. He looked at the podium. He looked at the chair at the head table where he'd sat and moved food around a plate for 2 hours while the evening built toward its single necessary moment. Then he took out his phone. She answered before the second ring. Jitae. It's done, he said. A pause. He heard her exhale, slow and long, the release of something she'd been holding all evening. Are you okay? He thought about the question seriously. I don't know yet. Ask me in a week. Okay. Her voice was quiet. Not the careful quiet of someone managing an interaction, just the natural, unperformed quiet of someone who was present and didn't need to fill the space. Do you need anything right now? He looked at the empty ballroom, the orchids, the disordered chairs. I'm going to leave here in a few minutes. I'm going to drive for a while. He paused. I'd like to drive past your building. A beat. That's a very roundabout way of asking. I know. Jitai, just ask. He was quiet for a moment. 34 years of building structures around himself. The professional architecture, the organizational hierarchy, the controlled surfaces and managed distances. And this was the thing that required the most effort. The simple, unarmored ask. Can I come? He said. Yes, she said immediately. No calculation, no pause to weigh it. Just yes, the same way she'd brought soup without being invited and stayed when he'd told her to leave and called that morning without a strategic reason. I'll put the kettle on. He drove himself for the first time in 7 weeks. No aide, no driver, just the company car that Daewoo had left in the front drive, and the December roads of Seoul at 11:30 at night, which were not quiet but were quieter than they were at any other hour. And he drove through the city's light grid with both hands on the wheel and his own thoughts for company. He thought about his father, who was asleep now in the family house in Seongbuk-dong, and would wake tomorrow to news that the test was over and the result was what he'd suspected. Jitai planned to visit him in the morning, not to report, they weren't that kind of father and son, but because it seemed right to be in the same room. He thought about Se-rin. He thought about her deliberately, which was different from the way she'd occupied his thoughts for the last 7 weeks, when thinking about her was an operational function rather than a choice. He let himself think about the 3 years before the accident, the functions, the dinners, the city appearances, the long evenings in the Hanam compound when she was present and warm, and he had understood, somewhere below the level of words, that something was not quite real, but had not been ready to look at it directly. He let himself sit with the fact that the test had not created her betrayal. It had only revealed what was already there. She would have arrived at the same destination without the wheelchair, more slowly, with less evidence against her, and he would have spent years married to a woman who was looking for the right moment to take what she wanted. The test had been necessary. The test had cost him something he was still calculating. Both of those things were true, and neither of them resolved the other. He let it go at the turnoff toward Mapogu, where Imani's building was, and he did not pick it up again. Her building was a mid-rise in a dense residential block, the kind of building that formed the functional backbone of the city, not architectural, not aspirational, simply present and solid and occupied by people living their actual lives. He found parking on the street and sat in the car for a moment, looking up at the lit windows of the 8th floor where she'd said she'd be, and he felt something he recognized, after a moment, as the specific texture of a moment before something changes. Not after, before. The last second of the before. Then he got out of the car and went inside. She opened the door before he knocked. She must have heard the elevator. The building was old enough that the elevator announced itself. And she was standing in the doorway in a worn olive-green sweatshirt and dark track pants, her hair loose, no part of her arranged for his arrival, and the kettle on the counter behind her was in fact already on. The apartment was warm and small and smelled like pepper, and something sweet he couldn't immediately identify, and the bookshelves on the far wall were 2 books deep because she'd run out of space on the front row, and there was a throw blanket on the couch that had been used recently, and a half-empty mug on the coffee table that she'd apparently been working on before he called. She looked at him. He stood in the doorway, still in the dark suit from the gala, and he was aware of how incongruous he was in this space. The suit, the organizational gravity, all the weight of the evening still on him. And she looked at him the way she always looked at him, with the direct attention that never became a performance of itself. And she said, "Come in." He came in. She made tea and he sat on the couch and she sat in the chair across from it, pulling her feet up, wrapping both hands around her mug, and she said, "Tell me what happened." So he told her, not everything, not the operational architecture, not the full structural detail of what the Black Phoenix Syndicate was and how it functioned and what the evening's revelations meant for its future, but the human shape of it, the test. His father's advice in the hospital room, the 7 weeks in the wheelchair, Se-rin's progressive withdrawal, the nights alone, the untouched tray. Sung-jae, Min-seok, The ballroom and the screens and Seirin walking out through a parted crowd in a white dress. Imani listened to all of it without interrupting. She was good at that. He'd noticed it from the beginning, the specific quality of her attention, the way she didn't fill silences with the reflexive responses that most people use to demonstrate that they were listening. She just listened. When he finished, the tea had gone cold in both their mugs. "The company," she said carefully. "Kang Group Holdings." "Yes." "The gap I've been not looking into." "Yes." He held her gaze. "What's beneath it is not clean, Imani. I'm not going to tell you it is or ask you to make peace with something without knowing what it is. You deserve the actual information, and you can decide what to do with it." She was quiet for a moment. "Is anyone being hurt by what's beneath it?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "There are parts of what I run that I would not call ethical. There are other parts that function as the only available structure in spaces where the legitimate alternative doesn't reach." He paused. "I'm not asking you to approve of it. I'm telling you it exists. And you're not going to stop. Not all of it. Some of it, some of what Sung Jae was managing, I'm going to restructure. Tonight changed some things." He paused. "Tonight changed a lot of things." She looked at her mug. She turned it slowly in her hands, the same small rotation he'd watched Sung Jae make with the wine glass. And he wondered if it was a thing people did when they were deciding something, the hands moving to give the mind a moment. "I've been coming to that compound for 7 weeks," she said, "bringing soup, staying too long, calling too early in the morning." She looked up. "I didn't do any of that because I thought you were someone simple." "I know. I did it because—" She stopped. She started again. "I did it because you were alone in a room next to a tray you couldn't reach and nobody had noticed. And that was true regardless of what the company was or who you were before the accident or what was beneath the gap." She held his gaze steadily. "That part is still true." Ji-tae looked at her. The lamp in the corner of the apartment threw a warm and imprecise light across her face, and she was entirely herself in it. No performance, no calculation, no managed distance. And he thought about what it had cost him to get to this room. The accident, and the weeks in the wheelchair, and the tray and the soup, and the phone call about the novel, and the 7-week performance of a man who was less than he was, which had required him, paradoxically, to become more honest than he'd been in years. "Lee Jun," he said. She blinked. "What about him?" "He called you into his office, told you to stay in your lane." Her expression didn't change much, but something behind it shifted. The faint surprise of someone whose private information has been accurately known. "How did you—" "He sent me a courtesy notification. That's protocol for my level of the organization." Ji-tae looked at her. "You're not going back to Lee Jun's team." "Ji-tae, I have a position in the organizational structure of Kang Group's above-ground operations that has been unfilled for 8 months because I haven't found the right person." He held her gaze. "It's a senior coordination role. It requires someone who can manage complex moving parts, maintain confidentiality under pressure, and function with a high degree of autonomy. The salary is—" He named a number. She stared at him. "That's a very different conversation from soup," she said. "It's the same conversation," he said. "It's just the next part of it." She looked at him for a long moment. The apartment was very quiet around them. The building's ambient sounds, the distant city, the cooling radiator ticking in the corner. "You're asking me to come work directly for you?" "Yes." "While also—" She gestured at the space between them, the couch and the chair and the 2 cold mugs, the imprecise territory of whatever this was. "I understand if those 2 things can't exist in the same—" "I didn't say they couldn't." She held up a hand. "I'm saying it's complicated. Most true things are." She looked at him for another moment. Then something in her face settled, not decided exactly, but the movement toward a decision, the internal architecture adjusting to accommodate a new configuration. "Give me a week," she said. "Take whatever you need." "A week." She stood and took his mug and carried both to the kitchen, and he heard the tap running, the mugs being rinsed, the small domestic sounds of a person doing something ordinary in a space that was entirely theirs. When she came back, she stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded and looked at him sitting on her couch in his gala suit at midnight and said, "You can stay, on the couch. You shouldn't drive across the city at midnight after whatever that evening was." "Imani." "The couch," she said firmly. There are blankets in the hall closet. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me." She turned back toward the hallway. "That's my line." He laughed. He hadn't expected it. The laugh came from somewhere unguarded, loose and brief. The sound of something releasing that had been held tightly for a long time. And she stopped in the hallway and looked back at him with something in her face that she didn't try to name or manage. And then she went to get the blankets. He took off his jacket and his tie and folded both over the arm of the couch and sat back and looked at the bookshelves, too deep with books she'd read, or was going to read, or had carried from Chicago to Seoul, because some things you carry regardless of the weight. The throw blanket on the couch cushion beside him, worn soft at the edges. The framed photograph on the wall he couldn't quite make out from where he was sitting. He thought about his father in the Seongbuk-dong house, asleep now. He'd call in the morning. Not to report. They weren't that kind of father and son. But to be in the same room as someone who had told him the truth when truth was the hardest commodity available. He thought about Dae-wook, who would sleep 3 hours tonight and be at his desk by 6 with the first round of legal filings ready and the documentation package formatted for the senator's office. Who had found the source and built the evidence and run the technical sequence in the ballroom and never once needed to be told twice. He would have to find a way to tell Dae-wook what that was worth. Dae-wook would deflect it. He would tell him anyway. He thought about Sung-jae. He thought about the tired face across the table, the wine glass turning in his hands, the confession delivered without excuse because there was no excuse available, and they both knew it. He thought about what Sung-jae had said. "She paid attention to me." And he thought about how a man could know the mechanics of manipulation in his sleep and still be undone by the oldest and simplest version of it. He would not forgive Sung-jae. That was not in the available range of responses. But he understood him now in a way that was almost worse than not understanding, because understanding a person's failure didn't make the failure smaller. It just made the person more real. Imani came back with blankets and a pillow and set them on the couch with the efficient matter-of-factness she brought to everything practical. She stood back and looked at him. "There's water in the kitchen. The bathroom is the second door. I work early, so the shower starts at 6, and I'm telling you that in advance because the walls are thin. I'll be gone by 5:30. You don't have to be." He looked at her. "I want to see my father in the morning, before the day starts." She nodded. Something in her face was quiet and warm and entirely without performance, and she said, "That's a good thing to do?" "Imani." She looked at him. "I've been testing the world for a long time," he said, "waiting for people to show me what they were. Setting up conditions and watching what happened." He held her gaze. "I didn't set up conditions for you. You just—" He stopped. Started again. "You just came. And you were just real. And I don't know what to do with that yet, except tell you it mattered." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp threw its warm, imprecise light. The radiator ticked. Outside, Seoul moved through its endless, enormous night, indifferent to all of them. "Get some sleep," she said. Her voice was soft. "You can figure out what to do with it tomorrow." She went down the hall. Jitae lay back on the couch and pulled the blanket up and looked at the ceiling of her small apartment and listened to the city outside and felt, for the first time in as long as he could measure, the specific and unmistakable sensation of being in a room where nothing was required of him. No performance, no assessment, no maintained fiction, no strategic calculation, no managed surface between himself and what was real. Just a man on a couch in a warm room. Just the city outside, doing what cities did. He was asleep in 4 minutes. Deeply, completely asleep, the way he hadn't slept in 7 weeks. And when he woke at 5 in the gray pre-dawn to the sound of Seoul beginning to reassemble itself for another day, he lay still for a moment and oriented himself. The bookshelves, the lamp still on low, the pillow that smelled like laundry detergent and something faintly floral, and he felt the day ahead of him take shape in his mind. His father, in the morning light of the Seongbuk-dong house, Dae-wook's office, and the work, the senator's committee, and the filings. The reorganization of everything Sung-jae had left behind, which would take months and would be difficult, and would require a level of internal reconstruction that he'd been avoiding, because reconstruction required admitting the degree of the damage. All of it, waiting, and underneath all of it, quieter than any of it, the week Imani had asked for, 7 days in which she would think about the gap, and what was in it, and what she was willing to know, and what she wanted from a life in which a man like him was a significant variable. He hoped she would stay. He did not arrange anything to ensure it. He did not build a structure around the hope or design conditions to increase its probability. He just hoped, in the simple, unfortified way of a man who has spent years protecting himself from exactly this kind of exposure and has decided, somewhere in the small hours of a December morning, that the protection was costing more than the risk. He folded the blanket and set it neatly on the arm of the couch. He put on his jacket. He picked up his tie and held it for a moment, and then he laid it on top of the folded blanket, a small, deliberate thing, a reason to come back that required no negotiation and no explanation. He let himself out quietly. He drove through the pre-dawn city with the heater on low and the radio off, and Seoul was gray and wide awake in the way it always was. And the Han River caught the first thin light of morning when he crossed the bridge, silver and enormous and moving the way rivers moved, indifferent, continuous, entirely itself regardless of what happened on the banks. He drove through it and came out the other side, and the city opened ahead of him, and he drove toward his father's house with both hands on the wheel and the window cracked just enough to let the cold morning air in, sharp and clean and real. Everything else would be what it was going to be. For right now, there was the river, the light, the road. For right now, that was enough.